In the late summer and autumn of 1347, news rippled across Mediterranean ports that a mortal sickness had arrived by sea. Within months, that news became a lived catastrophe. From Messina and Genoa to Marseille and Valencia, people watched as neighbors developed fever, painful swellings in the groin and armpit, blackened skin, and sudden collapse. By 1351, the wave had swept most of Europe, killing perhaps a third to a half of the population. Historians call it the Black Death. Modern science identifies the agent as the bacterium Yersinia pestis. Contemporaries knew only that it killed fast, often within days, and that the ordinary structures of life, family, work, worship, government, buckled under its weight. The scale was such that it not only ended countless lives but also reconfigured the economies, societies, and mental worlds of those who survived. This is the story of how a plague reshaped Europe between 1347 and 1351, and why the aftershocks lasted for centuries. Please subscribe for more video. The disease's deeper history lay far from Europe. Yersinia pestis circulates in wild rodent populations, particularly ground squirrels and marmots, maintained in complex enzootic cycles by fleas. In the 13th and 14th centuries, the Mongol Empire integrated trade networks across Eurasia, easing the movement of people, goods, and, inadvertently, pathogens. Several lines of evidence suggest that a plague focus in Central Asia experienced epizootics in the early to mid-14th century. Caravans pushed west across the steppes, and ships linked the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. In 1346, a siege at the Genoese trading outpost of Kaffa in the Crimea entered European lore. A later account claimed that Mongol besiegers catapulted plague-infected corpses into the city, an early example of biological warfare. Whether this detail is literal or rhetorical, the broad point stands: the Black Sea nodes connecting steppe and sea were the launch points for a pandemic. From there, maritime routes shaped the plague's first entry into Europe. In October 1347, ships likely carrying sick crew and rats infested with fleas docked in Messina, Sicily. Local authorities, alarmed by the illness, expelled the vessels, but the damage was done. The same season saw outbreaks in Genoa and Marseille. By early 1348, the disease moved along coastal trade lanes and inland river systems. Barcelona, Valencia, and Majorca suffered heavily. In January 1348, it reached Marseille. By spring it had moved north to Avignon, then the seat of the papacy. By late spring and summer, it was in Florence and Pisa, through to Siena and Venice, then beyond the Alps into the Rhineland, the Low Countries, and England. Ships carried it to English ports like Melcombe Regis in Dorset by June 1348, from there it spread toward London, which recorded major mortality in 1349. Scandinavia and parts of Eastern Europe encountered the wave by 1350 and 1351, often in uneven patches due to geography, seasonality, and local containment attempts. Understanding how the disease moved requires attention to biology and ecology. Yersinia pestis can cause bubonic plague when introduced via flea bites, septicemic plague when it invades the bloodstream, and pneumonic plague when it infects the lungs and spreads person to person through droplets. In the 14th century, the dominant form appears to have been bubonic, marked by swollen buboes and case fatality that could range widely but was often catastrophic without effective treatment. The blackened extremities described by some observers reflect tissue necrosis. Rats, especially the commensal black rat, Rattus rattus, thrived in medieval towns and ships, nesting in thatch and granaries, which made them efficient carriers of infected fleas such as Xenocilla chiopes. Some recent studies propose that human ectoparasites, like lice, also played a role under certain conditions. Regardless of the exact balance, the urban and maritime environments of 14th-century Europe were perfectly suited to sustain and disseminate plague. Contemporaries struggled to make sense of the calamity. Without germ theory, learned physicians leaned on humoral medicine and environmental explanations. Many medical treatises attributed the outbreak to a corruption of the air, perhaps caused by an unusual conjunction of planets in 1345 that was widely cited in astrological literature. Municipal authorities burned aromatic woods, lit great fires, and sought to purify the atmosphere. Practical attempts at containment also appeared, closing city gates, restricting travel, and establishing rudimentary forms of isolation. Avignon's own papal physician, Guy de Chauliac, described the disease's phases and noted the danger to caregivers. He survived, but his testimony captured the shock. Physicians died, and the usual hierarchies of expertise faltered. Faith, too, was tested. The Pope, Clement VI, granted general indulgences to the dying and the dead, recognizing the impossibility of last rites for all. Please share, subscribe and comment for more. Fear often seeks targets. Rumors accused minority communities, most notably Jews, of poisoning wells. Despite papal bulls declaring such accusations baseless and urging protection, anti-Jewish violence erupted. In 1348 and 1349, pogroms struck communities across the Holy Roman Empire and parts of France and Spain. Strasbourg's massacre in February 1349 is among the most infamous. Thousands were killed, many more fled or were expelled, reshaping the map of Jewish life in Europe. Another spiritual reaction was the rise of flagellant movements, bands of penitents who traveled town to town, publicly whipping themselves to atone for sin and plead for mercy. Authorities sometimes tolerated them, sometimes suppressed them, concerned about disorder and doctrinal error. The social fabric frayed under the strain, revealing tensions long present but usually contained. The scale of mortality is difficult to pin down with precision, but surviving records make clear it was unparalleled in European memory. Many cities saw losses of 40 to 60%, some, likely more. Parish registers, tax rolls, and wills from places like Florence, London, and Lubeck show the abrupt disappearance of names across a few months. Rural areas also suffered deeply, though data is patchier. The mortality shock had immediate practical consequences. Laborers, artisans, and specialists died alongside landlords and magistrates. Fields went untilled, harvests were lost or left partially gathered, building projects halted. Gaps appeared in guilds, monasteries, and cathedral chapters. Orphan children and widowed spouses navigated inheritance systems strained by the sheer volume of estates to settle. Burial practices changed, with plague pits and mass interment supplementing normal churchyard burials when clergy and gravediggers could not keep pace. Economically, the core fact of the post-1348 years was scarcity of labor relative to land and capital. With fewer workers available, wage pressures rose. In England, the Crown responded with the Ordinance of Labourers in 1349 and the Statute of Labourers in 1351, aiming to cap wages at pre-plague levels and compel service at customary rates. These laws proved hard to enforce consistently. Labourers had leverage. Similar dynamics unfolded elsewhere. Lords who had relied on labor services from serfs found it more practical, or necessary, to commute those obligations into cash rents to attract and retain tenants. In some regions, particularly in Western Europe, this accelerated the long-term decline of serfdom. Tenants bargained for better terms, acquired abandoned plots, and moved to towns in search of opportunity. On seigneurial estates, the shortages encouraged consolidation and sometimes shifts from labor-intensive arable farming toward pasture, especially for sheep. The expansion of wool production fed urban textile centers, reinforcing links between countryside and town. The new bargaining power was not evenly distributed. Land-rich but cash-poor nobles faced revenue crises and responded with various strategies, enforcing dues more aggressively, seeking legal redress to fix customary obligations, or diversifying into trade. Urban elites, too, attempted to manage volatility. Guilds welcomed new members to fill gaps but also tightened rules to defend wages and standards. Municipal governments grappled with the dual challenge of maintaining services and revenue in the face of tax base collapse. Some cities issued sumptuary laws, which regulated clothing and display, part moralizing, part social control in unsettled times. Incomes rose for many wage earners, but prices did not fall uniformly, and the gains were precarious. In the longer arc, Europeans after the Black Death enjoyed higher per capita consumption, better diets in some areas, and more meat and dairy, although regional and class differences remained pronounced. Political consequences followed economic shifts. In the generation after the first outbreak, Europe experienced a series of popular uprisings in which labor tensions, war taxes, and post-plague social change intersected. The Jacquerie in northern France in 1358, the revolts in the towns of Flanders and the Low Countries, the Ciompi uprising in Florence in 1378, and the English Rising of 1381 all drew energy from a world in which ordinary people had new aspirations and faced new constraints. Each revolt had its local logic: war devastation in France, urban guild politics in Florence, poll taxes in England, but the common context included a demographic regime profoundly altered by plague. War did not stop for disease. The Hundred Years' War between England and France continued through the 1340s and 1350s, reshaped by manpower shortages and fiscal strains. Plague did not decide battles directly, but it affected recruitment, garrisoning, and the capacity of rulers to extract resources from their subjects. Chevauchés, mounted raids, still devastated the countryside, complicating recovery. Yet the pandemic also fostered state building. To manage crisis, rulers refined tax systems, experimented with new levies, and strengthened bureaucracies, laying groundwork for more centralized fiscal states. The papal court in Avignon, which had already been a symbol of the Church's administrative might, became a focal point for theological debate about suffering, providence, and communal obligation. Cultural and intellectual life translated catastrophe into forms of expression that still shape European memory. Writers recorded what they saw. Giovanni Boccaccio opened his Decameron with a sober account of plague in Florence in 1348, describing not only symptoms but social responses, the collapse of care networks, the abandonment, and the efforts of groups to find refuge. Petrarch, grieving the death of friends, lamented the fragility of human greatness. Art developed new motifs. The Danse Macabre portrayed the universality of death, drawing kings and peasants alike into a single chain. Transite tombs depicted decayed bodies to remind viewers of mortality and the need for spiritual preparation. These were not simply morbid fascinations but efforts to integrate the unimaginable into familiar religious frameworks. Please share, subscribe and comment for more. Public health, as a set of practices and institutions, took halting but significant steps forward. Well before a modern understanding of contagion, cities experimented with measures that assumed something harmful could pass from person to person and place to place. Italian city-states developed boards of health. By the later 14th century and into the 15th, quarantine. 40 days of isolation for ships and travelers became a staple of port policy, first formalized in Ragusa, Dubrovnik, and refined by Venice. Lazarettos, or plague hospitals on islands or city margins, were institutional responses forged in the crucible of recurrent outbreaks. The Black Death was not a single event. Plague returned in local and regional epidemics for centuries. Those returns taught governments and communities how to respond more systematically, with cordon sanitaires, pest houses, and burial regulations, creating an administrative memory that would serve Europe through the early modern period. Religion and piety adapted in complex ways. Lay confraternities organized charity, endowments for chantries multiplied as testators sought prayers for the dead, new devotions flourished. At the same time, the sheer scale of indiscriminate death raised unsettling questions. Some believers sought stricter moral reform, others emphasized God's mercy. The clergy themselves suffered heavily, particularly those who ministered to the sick. Parishes struggled to replace priests, leading to concerns about training and standards and to the relaxation of some canonical requirements. This did not erase medieval faith, rather, it diversified its expressions and deepened the involvement of lay people in religious life, sometimes in tension with ecclesiastical authorities. Family structure and gender roles also shifted. With fewer people, inheritance patterns changed, and widows and daughters sometimes gained control of property they might otherwise never have held. Labor scarcity opened spaces for women in trades and in service, though guilds often resisted their full integration. Marriage ages may have risen in some regions, and fertility patterns adjusted to new economic realities. Communities that had lost a generation faced the task of transmitting skills and knowledge. Apprenticeship system stretched, masters sought new hands, the socialization of youth became a matter of civic concern. Demographically, Europe entered a long period of lower population with periodic setbacks from recurrent plague and other diseases. Recovery occurred unevenly. Some regions rebounded in the 15th century, others remained thinly populated for longer. Land abundance relative to labor encouraged mobility, peasants moved to better tenures, workers moved to towns that offered favorable wages, migrants repopulate areas depopulated by mortality and war. This mobility eroded some rigidities of the earlier medieval order. A person's place in the social hierarchy did not become fluid, the inequality of status and wealth persisted, but paths of advancement widened for some, and the material baseline for many improved. Agriculture reflected and reinforced these changes. With more land per capita, European farmers could choose better soils, abandon marginal plots, and diversify production. Pasture expanded in many places, feeding sheep whose wool supported a thriving textile sector in England, Flanders, and parts of Italy. Diets, for those who could pay, improved in quality, including more animal protein and dairy. Yet the gains were fragile. Bad weather, warfare, and new disease outbreaks could quickly reverse them. Moreover, lords and civic authorities tried to restrain change when it threatened their revenues or status, as wage and price regulations attest. The period is best understood as a negotiation, sometimes peaceful, sometimes coercive, over who would capture the demographic dividend that followed catastrophe. Urban life reordered itself. Cities that survived emerged with altered social topographies. Artisan quarters lost families, central parishes consolidated, new migrants refilled streets. Authorities invested in sanitation, water supply, and waste removal where finances allowed, partly in response to health fears. Hospitals and charitable houses multiplied, some founded by wealthy patrons as acts of piety, others sponsored by communal bodies. Not all the improvement stories sit comfortably. The same urban administrations that built hospitals also enforced segregation of suspected carriers, and the same communities that supported charity participated in persecutions when fear peaked. But taken together, the institutions of urban governance grew more capable and more interventionist. Intellectual life digested the shock in universities and beyond. Medical faculties debated the relative roles of celestial, atmospheric, and terrestrial causes. Plague tracts circulated widely, offering regimens for health that combined diet, purging, and avoidance of bad airs. Scholastics argued about divine causation and human agency. Slowly, practice shifted. Quarantine and isolation were empirical tools, not explained by humoral theory but justified by observed benefit. This pragmatic adaptation was a crucial legacy. It did not dismantle medieval science, but it added to it a repertoire of administrative techniques that could check disease even in the absence of deep understanding. In the very long run, that pragmatism nourished traditions of public health that later generations would build into more systematic theories and institutions. The environmental dimension deserves attention, even if sources are thinner. The depopulation of large regions likely led to reforestation of abandoned fields and a reduction in pressure on marginal lands. That change had effects on wildlife and on the balance of diseases. In some areas, wetlands expanded, in others, woods returned. The relationship between environment and disease remained dynamic. Rodents, fleas, and humans interacted across changing landscapes. Meanwhile, the maritime world continued to act as a conduit for recurring waves of plague, reminding Europeans that connectivity brought prosperity and peril in equal measure. As the immediate wave of 1347 to 1351 receded, Europeans looked back with a mixture of grief and calculation. Many survivors became wealthier than their parents simply because inheritance multiplied in thin families. Testaments reveal concern for memorialization, endowments for altars, gifts to hospitals, provisions for the poor. Nobles and towns invested in visible projects to signal resilience, cathedral works resumed, fortifications rose, market halls were repaired. Kings reorganized tax systems to stabilize revenues, aligning the interests of rulers and elites around more predictable governance. Even literature that did not focus on plague bore its marks: themes of fortune's wheel, of the equality of death, of the uncertainty of life's plans gained renewed force. Please share, subscribe and comment for more. To speak of the Black Death as an agent that reshaped Europe is not to suggest it acted alone or in a single direction. It intersected with war, climate variability, trade expansion, and political conflicts. It accelerated some trajectories already underway, like the monetization of rural dues in the West. It delayed or reversed others, especially in regions where elite control remained strong or where subsequent shocks compounded the damage. In Eastern Europe, for example, some forms of serfdom intensified in later centuries in response to Western demand for grain. The plague's demographic legacy played into those developments differently than in England or northern France. Causation runs through contingencies. But across the continent, the pandemic of 1347 to 1351 forced a renegotiation of work, authority, piety, and knowledge. When modern historians estimate that Europe lost between a third and a half of its people, the statistics can obscure the human scale: the vanished households, the empty workshops, the fallow strips on the village's open fields. Those absences were the seedbed of change. Wage laborers could walk away from bad terms. Tenants could move to better land. Women could leverage widowhood into economic independence. City councils could argue for public measures once seen as intrusive because the alternative was chaos. Even prejudice, while often lethal in the plague years, provoked new assertions of legal norms by rulers who condemned persecution, foreshadowing later debates about minority protections and civic order. The pestilence. CE did not inaugurate modernity, but it shifted the balance of possibilities. Europe in 1400 was not merely a poorer, emptier version of 1300. It was a different society, with altered expectations and tools. That difference framed the centuries that followed, a continent that would continue to battle plague and recurrences but would do so with memory, with institutions, and with an evolving sense that collective action could limit harm. The pandemic also left a permanent mark on Europe's imagination, a caution against hubris and a reminder of shared vulnerability. Kings and peasants alike were subject to the same mortality, a fact that political theology could never fully domesticate. The Black Death's reshaping of Europe was neither a simple story of decline nor of purification. It was a complex reallocation of life's chances. Catastrophe compressed time, forcing changes that might otherwise have unfolded over generations. In the space of 4 years, networks snapped and reknit. Laws were drafted in haste and then became precedents. Customs loosened, then hardened again in new forms. People mourned and then made do. The calamity's meaning was argued in sermons, ordinances, poems, and prices. If the numbers astonish, if we struggle to comprehend mortality on that scale, it is because the plague was both a human and a structural event, lived in households and legible in ledgers. Between 1347 and 1351, a bacterium exploited the seams of an interconnected world and, in doing so, altered the course of European history. The survivors built a different Europe atop the ruins, more mobile, sometimes more prosperous, often more regulated, and indelibly aware that the conditions of life can change with terrifying speed.